right? When I was at that 22 metre mark, I had mild symptoms. I waited for him to come back up, and on his way up, he was checking on me, and I'd written down on my wet notes, warm feet, question marks, slight numbness and pins and needles. I think I'm okay. I was obviously wrong.
You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount and cave diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and cave diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount and cave divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. This episode is brought to you by our sponsor X-Deep and by the patrons of Speaking Sidemount. Huge thanks to both for their support that makes everything you're about to watch and listen to possible. Well, hey, another episode. This month I've got Joseph Bicanic with me. Joseph hails from Western Australia. He specializes in running cave diving trips to the Nullarbor Plains, an amazing place, very, very remote in Australia, a limestone region, karst region where there's just tons of cave diving. So listen out for Joseph and I speaking about that. But in this episode, the reason I got Joseph on is he was recently involved in a cave diving expedition to South Africa, to Bushman's Hole. I'm really sorry to my South African friends, I cannot pronounce the Afrikaans word for it, but Bushman's Hole, famous, in fact, infamous for the site of the fatality of Dave Shaw some years ago, but also a site where many of the luminaries of deep and cave diving have dived, Czech Exley, Numo Gomez, to name a couple. And in this expedition, Joseph was joining Richard Harry Harris, Craig Challen, Don Shirley, and Dave Berry, and others on this expedition where Harry and Craig were seeking to continue their dives with hydrogen, so very experimental as we'll talk about. So they are approaching the 300 meter mark now, and as part of this, Joseph was also involved where he was doing mapping of the cave for Don Shirley and also trying to progress some of his own dive goals and get past the 200 meter mark. As you'll hear, this didn't quite go according to plan. Both Joseph and Harry got bent on the deep dives that they did. And this really is Joseph's story of what happened on those dives, what led up to the decompression sickness incident, what he experienced during that dive, and then what happened subsequently during his recovery from what was a really serious bend. All this and so much more in this episode of Speaking Sidemount. And we are recording. Hey, Joseph, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
Hey, Steve, how you doing, mate?
Doing awesome. And that's a question I have for you too. How's things?
Well, here, what's today? Today's the 24th, so tomorrow is kind of 5 months post the big dive, post the initial bend. The recovery is going along quite nicely. I'd like it to be further along than what it is, but you know, while we draw breath, everything is good.
Amazing. And I want to get into that. There's a great story behind that for those who don't know Joseph's story yet. We're going to cover that a little bit later. But I was trying to think back when the last time, because I think you and I have only met once, I hope I'm correct with that, and it was at the Shaft. And I think 2 years ago when we were diving there, we shared a dive, and it was an amazing dive site, and I want to ask you a little bit about that as well. But
sure.
The one thing that remains with me along with doing the dive was you very kindly sharing a coffee with me from the back of your truck, which was so well set up. A truck with an espresso machine on the back, which is very dear to a coffee shop owner's heart, and also had an amazing setup there for camping, and I think a full fill station on the back. But let's talk a bit about the Shaft just to get started.
Mm-hmm.
What an amazing place, and what an amazing, unique geographical formation, let's call it. Well, let's share some ideas or some views on the Shaft as a dive site and how you find it.
Well, okay, the Shaft. I think I've done that roughly 4 times now. It is an amazing hole. It's kind of funny thinking you're going for this epic dive, you know, and again on unless you're on a certain trimix stay, you're not allowed to go below 40, and even if it's a trimix stay, you're still limited to 60. That's one of the site rules set by the owner. There has been exploration deeper. From memory, I think it's about 125, the deepest people have been to. One of my favourite dives was with JDZ. I don't know if you met JDZ,
Yes.
one of the wet mules.
He did my advanced cave crossover.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
Yes, yeah.
So Nathalie, who's a Nat Geo videographer and photographer,
Yes.
was in the mount. This is going a few years back, and we staged it for her to do some video work. JDZ was on the far side. He was way off in the distance. I was at about 37 metres, pretty much at the top of the rock pile. Mm-hmm. And I was narked off my chops on air. I really know how narcosis hits me. And I was just like, wow. You know, my eyes were just popping out, looking at JDZ's light in the distance, and I was mindful of how narked I was. And it just goes deep, and it's so clear. And in the middle of a cow paddock, it's the last thing you expect, eh?
I mean, the story, let me recount the story, and I hope I get it right. Correct me if I make any errors here whatsoever, but you're in the middle of a cow paddock, and there's a hole in the ground that's vaguely 1.5 meters diameter, I want to say. That's now been built into a little manhole. You drop yourself through there about 8 meters to the surface, and there's a surface pond, let's say 12, 15 meters in diameter.
That sounds about right. Then with ropes around the edge so you can clip all your gear off and hit up.
Exactly. Yeah, and then it opens up into this massive sinkhole that's flooded. There's a ground called the Melbourne Cricket Ground, and I've heard it described as the same size as the Melbourne Cricket Ground. I'm not sure if that's correct or not, but yeah, what's the diameter of it, you think, at depth?
I don't know, but to say the Melbourne Cricket Ground, that wouldn't be wrong. I have circumnavigated at about the 40-metre mark, and it's quite a long swim. It is definitely a long swim. I think it took about 15, 20-ish minutes to get around that. So
15 meters a minute, you know, you're talking the 300 meters around or so. Just amazing. And then, as you said, down to 120 meters in depth. And the weird story behind it as well, the farmer, when it was first discovered, I think a horse back legs fell into the hole, something like that. And then he decided he'd fill it in because he didn't want his livestock falling in this damn hole. And truckloads and truckloads and truckloads and truckloads of fill went into the hole with no result. Finally, some divers go in to have a look, and you and I have seen it. There's the rock pile, right? The rock pile about 40 meters deep, and it's this little infinitesimal pile of rocks in this massive, massive, massive cavern. And, you know, just the sight up to the hole from the rock pile looking up, and I've taken video of it. It's on, if anyone wants to have a look, it's on my YouTube channel. I think from 2 years ago, the Mount Gambier trip, and there's a video of the day that we were there. And just this, and unfortunately my cameras couldn't do it justice, but, you know, 60 meter plus visibility, probably closer to 80, 90 meters of visibility, and you're just in this black hole of clear water. It's just a staggering experience.
And what was nice when we were there, Gary set up a mirror at the top, if you remember.
Yes.
Because we weren't getting direct sunlight. So by setting the mirror up at the top, it reflected down. And you had those sunbursts coming through the water. That was absolutely brilliant. I was doing some videography of people just swimming through.
We did the
sunburst.
same. Yeah, I was there with Robin Questa from Sulawesi, and Robin took some video of me. Unfortunately, it's with a GoPro, and the light sensor just simply isn't good enough to really do it justice. And yet we still got some really great shots of swimming through the light beams. Such a good experience. So, yeah, one of the very unique parts of Mount Gambier, I think. I've dived it twice now, I think. I don't think it's a dive that you do a lot, is it? It's not one that you go back and say, you know, I want to do the shaft every time I go to Gambier. I think once you've done it a few times, unless you could go deeper or do something different.
I'd agree with that. Like, if I'm in Mount Gambier and I have the opportunity to do the shaft, it's only because I'm there with someone else who hasn't done it. I would rather go and explore Tank Cave a little bit more.
For sure, yeah. But if you haven't done it, yeah, and I've done it twice, and maybe I'll do it again, I'm sure. But yeah, a little bit like you with people that I'm with who want to dive it, but just because you end up swimming round and round in circles around the circumference, don't you? And hanging out at the rock pile for a while until you build up enough deco, and then you go, okay, I've got to go up, and then there's not much else to do. But still, a really staggering experience.
Did you actually do Kilsby's then?
Yes, I've done Kilsby.
Yep.
In fact, on my last trip, I had the good fortune, let's call it, of teaching a side mount course in Kilsby and then ran a workshop. So I spent a week going up and down the many steps in and out of Kilsby, but it's just fantastic sinkhole, isn't it?
So actually, on that particular trip, I was diving Kilsby's. I was at my deco stop and someone above me was doing some cylinder management. And obviously not too well, because all of a sudden something just tapped me on the head. Luckily it wasn't, with a thick head like this, it wasn't too bad. So a cylinder just basically hit me on the head and then just went down to 30 metres or whatever it was at the bottom. So that was an interesting experience.
Oh man, yeah, I can imagine what that was like. Funny story too. During my course, one of my students who has been extremely well trained, she was fantastic. She was good from the start, and I just introduced her to side mount diving. But she was hanging below me. I was with another student, and I dropped a clip, and the clip fell onto her back. And because she was in such good trim, it just sat there. And I thought, oh, that's good. I'll come down and grab that in a moment. And just as I was about to come down and grab it from her back, she lifted her left shoulder to dump some gas from her dry suit, and it slipped off her back. So it was quite an amazing thing. Dropping it, seeing it go. Going, oh, that's pretty amazing that's fallen right in the middle of her harness. But anyhow, yeah, better than a cylinder though. Having a clip drop. So let's get on a bit. Obviously, you've been diving for a while now, a bit like me, I guess. But tell us a bit about how you got started in diving.
Oh, okay. At the age of 10, I saw my dad in a swimming pool doing a tri dive. And from that point, the idea of being able to breathe whilst underwater and stay stuck with me. Through my youth, I couldn't afford to go diving, but I did a lot of snorkeling. So I started a little bit later in life with diving. I ended up doing my dive course. Did a couple of tri dives at Heron Island. I then went and bought all of my equipment, even though I didn't have any qualifications at the time. Then when I moved to Perth, I did my open water here in 2001. And I thought open water was all I was ever going to need in one cylinder. And then you do course after course after course. And it's definitely a passion of mine. I never thought I'd get into cave diving. Then on a particular dive, I was being circled by a great white shark, and I thought that I would be in awe of a great white shark, and I'd be like, yay, I saw a great white. And this thing was huge, and the heart's going ka-chung, ka-chung, ka-chung. Cave diving took on a whole new aspect. There's no big bitey things in there. So
yeah, exactly.
That's what got me into that. That probably drove me towards cave. Then I needed to change tools, get into CCR. So I have both I use and teach the Revo CCR, the back mount CCR, as well as the Dive Right chest mount Optima or Choptima CCR, and we'll talk about those in a minute because I used both of those when I was in Bushman's. But some of my favourite diving still is good old open circuit side mount or some sort of closed circuit side mount system. So yeah, side mount is definitely my favourite way to dive.
Yeah, thanks for that. This is Speaking Side Mount after all, and we're going to talk a lot about your experience diving deeper where you're using back mount rebreathers, but it's great to hear that as well. Thank you. And one of the things, living in Western Australia and teaching out there, I know you are not only very enamoured with the Nullarbor as a region, but also run trips out there. And it's not a place I've been. A lot of people have spoken to me about it and said, you've got to get out there. We're in Mount Gambier twice a year, so I think at some point in our future, we're definitely going to see some of our group come out to the Nullarbor. So tell us a bit about the Nullarbor as a region and then the diving that can be done there.
Okay, so the diving that can be done. So with the Nullarbor, depending on which caves you do, some are actually close. Even though we're in Perth and the caves are in WA, Western Australia, Weebubby is just near the border of Western Australia and South Australia. It's actually closer to South Australia than it is to Perth. Now, Weebubby is actually temporarily closed at this point in time because there was a collapse. Yeah. So that'll be interesting to find out what's going on. So Weebubby is the easternmost cave to drive to on the Nullarbor in Western Australia, and it's about a 15, 16-hour drive from Perth, depending on how many stops you have. Weebubby is probably the single prettiest entry that you can possibly get into. It is with most of the high plains. So the high plains caves, I'll talk about them first. So the high plains, where you camp, is 90 metres above sea level. The water is at sea level, so your walking distance is roughly about 300 linear metres from when you step over the doe line to get to the water's edge. The easiest thing to do on the Nullarbor is dive. The hardest thing to do on the Nullarbor is get to the water's edge. What I do is I facilitate a slightly easier way to get there. So with the combination of A-frames, flying foxes, fill lines, so that you're filling at the water's edge. And filling at the water's edge is kind of cool because instead of hearing compressors and everything going off, you hear nothing. You hear absolutely nothing. So I've got a decent sized compressor. We're filling up to 4 cylinders at a time, plus 2 up topside if need be. So with Weebubby, you're looking at, from memory, 350-ish metres linear penetration. Down the bottom of Weebubby is about 48 metres in depth. Looking forward to actually getting out and doing some mapping out at Weebubby with a mate of mine, Hugh Porter. Hugh led up a team recently where we did a new map of Murray. I don't know if you've seen that new map of Murray by any chance. I'll have to send it to you. So the old map of Murray, I think, is back from 74, so it's 50 years old. We did a new map of Murray. Murray is one of the closer caves. When I say closer to Perth, it's about an 11-hour drive from Perth if you're driving straight, okay, doing the speed limit, yada, yada. Otherwise, it's going to take you a bit longer. Murray has a maximum depth of approximately 14 metres, and there's quite a bit to go through at Murray, and it's my favourite cave to be teaching. I'm also a cave instructor, CDAA and TDI. So with CDAA, I'm an advanced cave instructor, and because of the complexity of Murray, I've got a dispensation to run single site courses, whereas if I was in Mount Gambier, I'd have to run 2 sites. Now, the sites in Mount Gambier are a lot smaller. At Murray, you can do 4 different dives and go to 4 different spots. And then you still haven't seen all of the caves. And you can even go through 1, 2, 3 different entries from the entrance pond. One being a cave level. The other one is, definitely towards the end of your cave course. It's getting a bit tighter. And the other one is post-advanced cave, where it is definitely single profile only and very tight and squeezy. So Murray's a great site for stuff like that. Again, 90 metres above sea level. Cocklebiddy, that would be the most famous cave that we have out there.
Yes.
It's got 3 sumps. First sump is basically, it's about 700-800 metres swimming if you go to the end of the lake. But if you're scootering, the first sump's about 1 kilometre. Then you've got the rock pile. So you've got to get your gear over the rock pile. Then you've got sump 2. That's about 2.5 kilometres. Pretty amazing dive through there. I did that just last year with some mates, where we went to the end of sump 2. And what was odd, when you have a halocline, I've only ever noticed haloclines being at a constant depth. So if your halocline's at 6 metres, it's 6 metres all the time. At Cocklebiddy, the depth of the halocline was changing. I actually recorded, I was writing this down on my slate because I've never seen that. Right. I don't understand why, but there were spots where it could have been at 11 metres, other spots it was at 13 metres in sump 2. Panican Plains, that is now my favourite high plains cave. That is the hardest cave to get into. At the moment, it too is temporarily closed. There's been a bit of movement in Panicans as far as the rocks are concerned, so we need to get back out there. Hopefully in November, we're going out with a crew to do an inspection to see how we can actually get through safely and make sure it is safe to get through. So that's a project that's going on in the background. We're looking at getting that done sooner rather than later. Panicans, Sump 1, it's a lot deeper. Sump 1 has an average depth of about 25 metres. The maximum depth is about 33. But lovely, lovely scootering cave. When you get it to the end of Sump 1, then you've got to walk across an area called Concord Landing. So you walk across one section, swim through another section, walk across to the last section, and then you go through to Sump 2. I've been to the end of Sump 2, but when you get to the end of the Sump 2, it's a chimney. At that point, we turned the dive and exited. I do know that those better than me climb up through the chimney and then they can get into Sump 3. That's real heavy-end expedition stuff. So Panicans would be the logistically hardest one to get through. So I have Flying Fox going from the top to the first drop zone. When you start entering the cave, you then use friction devices to lower gear. At the end of the trip, we redirect the Flying Fox to bring it up over that area. And down the bottom, we also set up a last Flying Fox. And I'm really excited about getting out there again for the last Flying Fox, because I had this winch made up where you can get a Milwaukee 18-volt battery, put it into the winch, and that's going to drive the Flying Fox at the bottom. Because sending the gear down, gravity does the work. Pulling the gear back up, it's a lot of manpower. So a lot of toys. The other one on the high plains is Tommy Graham's. Not very gear intensive, but very hard to get to the bottom. But out on the low plains, the row plains, you're only roughly 10, 11 metres above sea level, so getting into the caves are a lot easier. Olwalgan has to be my favourite on the low plains because of the fact that it's so easy to get to, and you've got over 11 kilometres worth of this spider web system.
It's amazing.
Oh, it is. So I was out there roughly 3 weeks ago, and like, I'm more of a distance junkie than a depth junkie any day. I'm way more into my distance, and we were almost at the end of the cave, and I've put my computer up into the ceiling. So we're about 3 kilometres back in a cave, 2.4 metres to the roof. You know, no deco, and super easy. Chest mount, rebreather for myself in Sidemount configuration. Absolutely brilliant. We also dived Banabi Cave, which is quite interesting. You've got to crawl through on your belly just to get to the water's edge. That, I think, has about a kilometre and a bit worth of passage. There's also some more exploration going on out there. We did Slot Cave as well. So there's more exploration being done. So that's pretty much about the Nullarbor.
Yeah, amazing. And I mean, to describe the place, obviously, Australia is a massive, massive country, and we've got a global audience listening to this too. So obviously, everyone will know Australia, and probably most are aware that most people live on the coasts, eastern coast, southern coast, and a little bit on the western coast, not so much towards the north. And then there's a massive, massive desert area in the centre, and the Nullarbor kind of sits off the desert, really, doesn't it?
It does. So the Nullarbor, most of the caves are approximately 10 to 15 kilometres as the crow flies, right, from the coastline itself. And the other thing that you have to remember, typically speaking, if something goes wrong and you need to buy a spare, it's generally a 6 to 9 hour drive to get to a basic dive shop, let alone a decent hardware shop, or to buy tyres. We had a guy lose a couple of tyres, and he had to drive from Cocklebiddy. He had to use someone else's car to get from Cocklebiddy out to Kalgoorlie. So that's ballpark of 6.5 hour drive each way just to get tyres.
Yeah, massive distances. And of course, for someone like me from a tiny little country like New Zealand, vaguely the same size as Great Britain and Japan, driving long distances is abhorrent to us, right? A long drive for me to Auckland is 4 hours. And so to comprehend, 10 plus hour drives, 24 hours from places like Adelaide, Mount Gambier is such a long way, isn't it?
Very much so. For us, it's just down the road. Like we could easily go for a day trip from the eastern sites, as in, say, Murra. It's like a 3.5 hour drive out to Weebubby, and don't really think a great deal about it.
Yeah. And of course, because you're so remote, you're camping, right? So talk a little bit about how you live when you're out on the Nullarbor.
Camping, glamping.
Right.
Now, the first thing, if it's your first trip out to the Nullarbor and you're starting to get into it, I always recommend to people either hire something to see what you like you can hire either a camper van, a four-wheel drive camper van, a camper trailer or the like, and then look at what everyone has for a setup, because the younger you are, the more you're going to tolerate. So some people get out there just with their basic four-wheel drive. They will have their swag. They will then have either a gazebo or some sort of awning, right? And that's it. Then you've got all your cooking equipment. Myself, at the moment, I happen to have a camper trailer. Because I'm leading the trips, by the time I get up to the top, I'm not interested in cooking dinner. I'm really good at reheating. So I've got my air fryer, I've got my microwave. So you've got to have and of course the coffee machine. You've got to have your essentials. So yes. I prefer the camper trailer style setup. So it could be anything in between that. Some people just empty out the back of their ute and put their swag on top of the ute. If the weather's good, that's all you need. That will work quite nicely. In 2020, I think it was, we did a trip to Panic in the Plains, and we had a lot of rain and wind come through. Pretty much did a lot of damage to the awning on my tent. So, you do get a lot of winds through there. So you've got to be prepared to replace equipment, repair equipment. One very, very miserable night, the only area that we had that was undercover was the awning of my camper trailer, which was big. We're talking about, say, 2.5 meters wide by about 5 meters long. There were 4 of us in there, and underneath us was just a river of water going through. So it was rather miserable, but in the caves was good. So, you can have 4 seasons in one day, because there is nothing stopping the weather from coming through. It's all very flat. So I've had it in summertime where we've entered a cave in the morning at 45 degrees at 9 o'clock, and we've exited the cave at night, say 4 in the afternoon with 25 degrees. This is midsummer. So you get some massive swings. You have to bring everything. Right, you have to bring everything. So anyone on my trip, I post a list of what to bring, what to do, and I also have a video of what to expect on the Nullarbor, because your first trip, you're never going to be prepared. It's very exhausting because it's hard work. Every time you finish a dive, we all know we finish a dive, the first thing we should do is rest. Well, to get back to the surface, it's the equivalent of climbing a 30-story building. Right, this is post a dive. So if you want it, you've got to bring it. People coming from interstate, they can't bring certain fruit and vegetables over the border, so we might do a bit of shopping for them. So yes, if you want it, you've got to have it. You've got to bring spares. So therefore, you need solar. So we tend to use both. We use solar, we use gas, plus generators, because if the sun's not shining, you're going to need your Jenny. If the sun's shining, happy days. So you need lots of different versions of backup. And let's say, for example, someone's fridge died. Well, you try and then utilize everything in that person's fridge between everybody, so that you're emptying out what they've got, and then they will then use everyone else's equipment, because that piece of equipment is gone. Unlike a typical dive holiday where you're going back to your room, right? In this one, you're going back to your tent. Everyone's around the campfire at night. You're living in each other's faces. So you've got to be a bit more tolerant. Simple little things like if someone's done the fire one night, you do the fire the next night. Go and get some wood. Participate. Don't wait for everyone else to do something. Everyone has to pull their weight, whether it's open or closed circuit. Like, for example, if we're doing certain trips like Old Walgan, to fill the cylinders for a closed circuit diver, per diver open circuit, you could have 4 cylinders a day compared to maybe a 2-minute top up for a closed circuit diver. But everyone has to do some of the work. So, yeah, you've got to have that camaraderie and be a bit tolerant.
Yeah, awesome. Oh, it sounds amazing. And at some point, I'm sure we'll get ourselves on a trip out there. It's just getting our head around the remoteness. And I guess the other thing that I know when talking to Gary Barclay and Harry and Ryan Kichkowski and others about it is, you've really got to take care not to injure yourself out there, because if you have a problem, then it's a long way to get help, isn't it?
It's a very long way. Like at Tommy Graham's, for example, someone was saying we should take a stretcher through to Tommy Graham's. You can't fit it through the entrance. The entrance is known as the birth canal. You can figure out why. Mm-hmm. It's that hard to get through. Someone your size is going to get through a lot easier than someone my size. You've got to be a bit of a contortionist to get through the entrance. Yeah. So you just, you can't get stretchers through, let alone in places like Panikins or Cocklebiddy, where you've now gone through the sumps and you're now into the dry chambers. If something happens there, it's a long way out.
Yeah, but still, I mean, it's a real adventure, isn't it? And real kind of expedition style diving, and sounds brilliant. So at some point, I'm sure we'll, as I said, make our way out there. Excellent. Now, something I want to ask you about, you came to my attention more recently for the expedition you're involved in with Craig, Harry, Don Shirley, and others to, I can't even say the Afrikaans name, but let's call it Bushman's Hole.
Yep, that'll do.
You might be able to help me with the Afrikaans for it. But Bushman's, a very famous... very famous
I don't get it
sinkhole.
right, but it's something like that.
Yeah, very famous sinkhole in South Africa. Probably a little bit infamous too, because of the fatality of Dave Shaw there a while ago. But but the history before that, dive by Sheik Exley. So some of the real luminaries, Nuno Gomes as well. Some of the real luminaries of deep diving in the world have been there. Some records I think may have been broken. Tell us a bit about. Firstly, tell us about how you got involved in the project, and then a little bit about Bushman's Hole itself as a dive site or as a sinkhole. Okay.
After reading all about the story with Dave Shaw, always wanted to go there. 2016, I had the privilege of meeting Don and Andre out on the Nullarbor. They were touring Australia most years. The CDAA have an international guest speaker, and they tour the country for all of its members. So from South Australia, when they come across to Perth on the way, they were doing a Nullarbor trip. So I met them out on the Nullarbor. We hit it off. It was great. So I had intended to do a trip over to South Africa. So in 2019, I was organising a trip, and I was going to have Craig and Harry on my trip in 2019, and towards at the end of 2019, I can't remember, but something happened and travel kind of stopped for a bit.
Bummer.
Then, yeah. So last year, basically early last year, Harry then was onto it, and he then started a trip, and I was invited onto Harry's trip. I was happy to go as a support diver. So that was organised primarily by Harry. That was great. My goals were, A, I wanted to go there. B, it was a personal goal to go to Bushman's and dive some of the areas with Don and Andre. Andre, unfortunately, wasn't diving, but Don was. I wanted to get involved in some of the mapping that was happening there. Of course, I wanted to support Craig and Harry in any way that I could, and wanted to have a ball with my mate Dave Berry, and we had an absolute ball. So they were my goals for being out there.
Yeah, fantastic. And I mean, Bushman's Hole itself, an amazing site, and we'll talk about some of the geographical things about it as well. But obviously this trip, we're mentioning Harry, and I hope everyone knows who that is just by one name, but we're talking Richard Harris, who's been on Speaking Sidemount twice, and notable for his participation and crucial role he played in the Thai Cave Rescue as the anaesthetist that actually anaesthetised the kids, and was instrumental along with the CDG group and the other international divers and the cast of literally 10,000 who worked on that. So amazing. And Harry has also been involved in exploration of Pierce Resurgence in New Zealand here, and doing sub 250 metre dives to achieve this. And most recently has been experimenting with the use of hydrogen, which he's spoken about at the Rebreather Forum and other places, incredibly experimental, and even in Harry's words, but they're really pushing the boundaries and finding ways that they can approach the 300-meter line with that. And so that was really, I think, their objective for this trip, wasn't it?
Correct.
Yeah, and I mean, as part of that, obviously there was some deep diving opportunities for you as well. And I know you mentioned earlier that your thing is really cave distance, but you're starting to get to some really serious depths yourself. And what were your goals for this trip in terms of the diving that you were doing?
Okay, I did want to. One of my goals was to actually hit the 200-meter mark. So that was a personal goal of mine. One of my other biggest goals was the mapping, because when we got there, Don was telling us about some of the mapping projects that have been going on, and in the days leading up to that, final dive, we'd been diving for about 10 days, and we had gathered some amazing data. So we'd come up at night, told Don what we'd do, show him the information, and his eyes are popping out because it's like he just hadn't seen this data before. Now, right. I'd like to say that we're amazing at mapping and we're super experienced and we really know our stuff. But when you've got a sea craft with an ENC on it, it does a lot of the work for you, mate. And that was absolutely brilliant. So in Bushman's, there are a few lines around the place. So the way the shape of the cave goes, you've got a throat that comes down at a slight angle to about 50 metres. It then straightens out and opens up. Okay. Now the first line actually goes across the ceiling. That is at 50 metres. It goes to the other side and it goes straight down. Right. It's known as the escape line, because if you're on the other side at the 60-metre line or the 80-metre line, instead of having to come all the way around and clock up all that deco, you can get to the escape line, go up, right? So, and it's a lot closer going the escape line. We now know that. We didn't know that before because we didn't know. It was assumed that the sinkhole was circular. The cave was circular, right? We now know that it's not. It's way more like an oval shape. So I wanted to get involved in the mapping. The 80-metre circuit was started by Don 9/11/2001. So wow. And it, as you can imagine, when he came out of the water, things changed on that day. Yes. So he didn't go back on that particular day to do any more diving. And when Don goes out, he's leading trips, which means he's there basically facilitating the trip. So his mapping takes second place. So quite often he'll go out, barely dive, maybe not do a great deal of mapping, whereas on this trip there was so much mapping going on. Now on the 80-metre circuit, previously Don had gone, as you're looking down the cave, he'd gone clockwise, probably about 3/4 of the cave. He then ran another 80-metre line anti-clockwise, hoping to run into it. Now that one probably went around 40%, but they didn't meet. So one of the dives, my buddy Dave Berry and myself went down to the 80-metre. We went anti-clockwise, right? And then we connected the two lines together. So right. that was pretty cool. Another one of the dives, we then took the ENC, that's the electronic navigation console that's available from Seacraft. Amazing piece of technology. So that was calibrated at the surface. We then descended down to 80 metres. We did the 80-metre circuit. We ascended. We did the 60-metre circuit. We then ascended and we did the entire escape line back down to the 80-metre mark and back out. Now, after we had done that particular dive, right, we were then able to import the data into Google Maps and overlay it over the cave.
Wow.
So it gave us an idea of what it looked like. Now, these particular maps, right, I'm like, even though I've got these maps, I don't share it with anyone. If I'm giving a talk, I'll show it at a talk based on no photographs. To me, this is all about Don. When he's ready to release any of the information publicly as far as maps are concerned, that's up to him.
Yes.
So I'm going to respect that that is his project. But the information with that one particular dive where we did the 80 to 60 in the escape line, it was sent to JDZ, who extrapolated it out into a 3D map. And that was amazing. So you could actually see the shape of the cave. And as we went from the 60 to the 80, we could see that the cave was getting wider at the southwestern section. So we could now see that on the map. We could also, so it also gave Don the ability to look at the escape line and know that the escape line had to be moved more centrally, right? So now there's data on where is the escape line? Where should the escape line be? What do these lines, what do these lines actually look like? Not only did we do those ones, but Dave and I also started on a 100-metre line. So we descended down to 100, started running a line, and this was quite interesting. I'd like to say of course we did all of the line work, when in actual fact, I'm videoing on one scooter, Dave's scootering along, holding his reel, right? Finding somewhere to tie off to, tie. So again, you're at 100 metres, you're on scooters, you're on CCR, and if you lose your control, it's a little bit of a descent down to 280 metres. So you've really got to be on top of what you're doing. So power to Dave, he really did a great job in running the reel out and finding places to tie off to. So we believe about 40% around the cave. And again, when we took that information from the ENC into Google Maps, we could see that again, the cave was getting wider in that southwest area. At that 100-metre mark, the wall was going relatively straight and it looked as if there was another undercut. That undercut could have been 2 metres, it could have been 5 metres. We couldn't see, although the water is crystal clear, as per video evidence, the walls are so dark,
black,
everything's just black. So that's a bit of a shame that we couldn't see. So that 60-metre, let me just give you a bit of data here. Just bear with me a sec.
No worries.
So we know that the 60-metre circuit is a 420 metre, so it's 420 metres around for the 60-metre circuit. We now know the 80-metre circuit is 490 metres. Of the 100-metre circuit that we laid, it's about 200 metres. So we believe we've laid about 35% of that. It'll probably be around the 530-metre mark. So it is getting a little bit wider. We now know the escape line is 40 metres in one direction, and it was thought that there was about a 10-degree turn. It's not, it's a 90-degree turn, right? Wow. And it goes 60 metres in the other. So the escape line is 100 metres long, but it needs to be pulled back, right, to make it central. But now we know that. So Don was saying to us, we'd gathered more data in the days that we were there, in the 10 days that we were diving, than had been gathered before. Now, and again, that's thanks to today's technology. I'd like to say that we're experts at this, but it was thanks to today's technology.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, amazing technology, and a lot of this is behind a lot of the advances that we're seeing in cave mapping. I mean, you may have seen the new work that Martin Slater's done on Tank Cave. And yeah, that's pretty amazing, the maps that have been done from that, and a complete remapping of it with Josh. He's done from episode 100, did all the leg work for that, all the swimming work. So an amazing thing that the new technology is now. That was with Nemo, of course, but awesome to see that. Great to see Seacraft used too. I dive the Seacraft DPVs as well, the Go, and love it. Don't have an ENC, so maybe that's my next purchase, is to put one of those on it.
They're pretty cool. They are. One of the features which is really, really nice is the go home button. I was showing a friend of mine the go home button, and as we were diving in the river, you could just see the directional turn 90 degrees. I turned 90 degrees. We've popped up, and my buddy was like, "Oh, she was just blown away. I wanted to go out and get one straight away." So yeah, they're pretty cool.
Okay, so your diving progressed there. You did this amazing mapping, and then you were targeting the deeper dive of your trip. Tell us about how that went.
So we did some build-up dives to get to depth, and then on the on the dive that I did, the 210, my goal on that dive was, apart from a personal best of that particular depth, the goal was actually to video Craig and Harry do the gas switch at 200 metres. So right. I had entered the water just before them, and Craig politely said to me, he goes, "We're using scooters. If we overtake you and you're not there, right, and we've done our gas switch, we have to keep going, right? So try and keep up if possible." My descent rate was, I worked it out on my computer, it was about 22. So my descent rate was 22 metres a minute to get to depth. And on my way down, as I'm rocketing down at 22, their sea crafts are pointing down and they've just overtaken me. So I've got video footage from a distance as I'm slowly catching up to them. But by the time I got to 210, they were on their way. So that was a bit of a shame. When I did get to, now what was a little bit on the scary side is at about the 175 metre mark, right, you've got the main descent line, and then there's I think it's two other lines from previous trips where people had been doing, I think that other people were doing free diving, right? And with the free diving lines, instead of actually pulling up the rope, I'd say that when they went to pull up the rope, the weights must have been caught in that throat and they weren't able to pull it up. That's what I suspect. I don't know. I suspect. So what ended up happening is ropes were cut. So as we're going down, you get to 175 metres and there are these two snaky looking ropes just sitting very, very close to the main line. And you know, it's not the nicest thing to be entangled in something like that.
No. Luckily,
I didn't have an issue, but I've got video footage of this snaky rope, and it's not good. It's not good. There's a bit of footage that I've saw of Harry's from his GoPro at depth, where you can see the weights and these additional ropes. So I went past that. I got to the 210 mark. I looked down at my computer. The Delta plus 5 function.
Yes.
Yeah, that was kind of scary. I think the Delta plus 5 gave me something like another 400 minutes of deco or something like that.
Unreal.
It was so that was quite interesting. So once I'd achieved that, I was on my way up. So then on the way up, my first stop was at 72 metres. Got there, no problems. So the decompression dive, my decompression dive was going along nicely until I got to about the 24 metre mark. When I got to 24 metres, I felt warm feet. Now, have you ever heard of warm feet as a symptom of decompression illness?
No.
Now, when that happened, that threw me. I had warm feet. I was also having pins and needles and a little bit of numbness. Now, the pins and needles and numbness, that was obviously alarm bells, but the warm feet threw me. So I was wondering if it was nothing more than, okay, I was a little bit warmer on that dive. On previous dives, I had I had a set of the J2s undergarments. I'd wear the top. I wasn't wearing the J2 bottom. Knowing that I was going to be in the water for about 4 hours, I thought I might put the J2s on, and I suspected that warm feet was nothing more than the J2s and the fact that I had nice warm woolly socks. When I started to feel these symptoms, I dropped back down to 30 metres and I stayed there for a few minutes, and symptoms weren't dissipating. I was staying 3 to 4 metres below my decompression stop until I got to about the 12-ish metre mark. For the rest of my dive, I was staying 3 to 4 metres underneath it. But at the 12-ish metre mark, all symptoms had dissipated, right? So I was symptom-free at the 12 metre mark. Prior to that, Dave Berry, he had actually, part of his role on that particular dive was to enter the water, drop down to 100, confirm with Craig and Harry that their dive was, they were okay, their dive was successful, and catching up on how they were going to progress as far as their decompression was concerned.
Right.
As he was descending, I didn't want to interfere with his task of going to the bottom. Right. At the time, when I was at that 22 metre mark, I had mild symptoms. I waited for him to come back up, and on his way up, he was checking on me, and I'd written down on my wet notes, warm feet, question marks, slight numbness, and pins and needles. I think I'm okay. I was obviously wrong. Now, at that point, so Dave knew what was going on with me. He ascended back to the surface, passed the information on. With myself, by the time by the time I got to, I think, the 12 metre mark, I was symptom free. I was also able to pee in the water. So as I had no problems with that, again, I'm thinking, yep, tick, everything is looking good. Exactly.
Relieved.
Yes. When I then stayed in the water a little bit longer. I think I was in the water for 15, 20 minutes post-deco. I exited at GF 67. So my GF was at a reasonable rate when I exited the water. It was a reasonable percentage when I exited the water. Got out, everything was good. And once I got out, I did feel tired, but I also put it down to the fact that we had been doing multiple days of diving. We were on an expedition. We weren't having the most comfortable beds. We were on thin mattresses in little tents. It is what it is when you're out there. So I just thought I was tired. At the end of hour one, it went from feeling tired to I'm starting to feel more fatigued. So the warning bell started to go off around the 2 hour mark. So then when I got to about the 2.5 hour mark, I think Don and Andre contacted Dan, right? So Don, he was onto it. I was in denial how bad things were, right? And what really bugs me with the benefit of hindsight is I've had other mates that have been bent, and I really didn't. I actually listened to their body language, not what they were saying. Right?
Yes.
Both needed to get to the chamber, and that's all that mattered. I should have taken as much care of myself as what I did for others. So one of the big things people hear is, if you think you're in trouble, put your hand up. Right? Just put your hand up and get help. It's a lot easier to get help immediately than help later on. It's a lot easier for everybody. One of the other things is I didn't want to be the one ruining the trip. If I'm out of the water and I've got to go to the chamber, well, that now means does that mean that everyone else can't dive anymore? They've got to pull the equipment out. So there's that opportunity cost, and I was feeling guilty about that. I shouldn't have. I should have, by looking out for myself sooner, I would have been looking out for everybody sooner. So we've got to be mindful of, if stuff goes wrong, take care of ourselves as we would with others.
And that's a really common feeling, isn't it? I mean, the same thing occurs on big dive trips. Imagine you're on a boat out somewhere in the Truck Lagoon. Same thing happens, or somewhere else for that matter. The boat has to go back if you're bent, right? And so everybody, I think that it's a very, very natural feeling or thought process for someone to go through and say, hey, I don't want to spoil everyone else's day. Maybe I'm not bent. Probably I'm not bent. I hope I'm not bent.
Oh, yeah. Look, at the second and third hour, I'm still thinking to myself, this is going to pass. Next week, I'm going to be at Camaraderie Springs. Happy days. Not so much. By hour 3, I tried to go and pee. I couldn't. And I was walking with really wobbly legs. So I was starting to lose the use of my legs. By this stage, I was on oxygen. Reality's starting to set in. Don's talking to Dan. Now, one thing that I wasn't pleased about, it took about 4.5 hours, 5 hours for Dan South Africa to get the information from Dan US, who does Asia Pacific, to actually approve my airlift. Step one, are you qualified to do a 210 metre dive? Now, have you seen a 210 or anything above 100 metre?
Who is?
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Now, as much as I was disappointed in how long it took Dan to approve it, I'm also equally, if not more, disappointed in myself for not having contacted Don and saying, hey, if I've got to get airlifted, right, to Joburg, or if one of us has to get airlifted, what is the cost, right? Mm-hmm. Because if we knew that, and I knew the cost, and with the benefit of hindsight, right, had I known the cost, I would have argued with Dan later about the cost rather than waiting that time period. So I've got to, I can point the finger at Dan, but there's three fingers pointing back at me. So we as a team should have found that out in advance, because we were in a very remote area. So that's something that I just need people, I can complain about Dan. I can equally complain about me. Let's be fair about this. When it got to about so at the 3 hour mark, when I couldn't pee, then it was a case, Don said, right, Joesph can't have any more fluids until he can either urinate or alternatively airlift it out with a catheter. At the 7 hour mark post-bend, we got the okay from Dan. Yes, the chopper's going to be coming. Great. And the chopper was going to land about the 9 o'clock mark. We then had to get me from the water's edge, topside, which was about 50 meters difference in altitude. Tried to walk, that wasn't going to work because I had, by this stage, almost no use of my legs whatsoever. They put me on a stretcher. They got me to about 10% of the way up. Then there was this rocky incline of about 80 degrees that went for about 4-ish meters. They couldn't get me up there. As they lifted me up, my body slid down the stretcher, right? And the straps were actually strangling me, like, put me down. So they put me down, and it's like, lift me up. So they had to lift up the stretcher, pull me back just so I could breathe. And then I was like this on the stretcher on the way up. I got off the stretcher at that point, and what we had to do to get me up is I had to use my elbows to climb, and then I had one person on my right bum cheek, one other person on my left bum cheek, and it's like, right, you put my leg there. Great. Now push my ass up. You put my knee there. Push my ass up. Good. Now put my foot there. And they're slowly pushing me up while I'm trying to elbow up. That took about 10, 15 minutes to get that 5 meters. Then I was back on a stretcher and up topside. So finally got topside, got into the chopper. I was at Joburg by about midnight. I was taken in straight away. The great thing about Dan organising the chopper versus me organising a chopper and arguing later, Dan then do everything and I'm ready to go to the chamber. Whereas if I paid for the chopper and it wasn't yet approved by Dan, the chopper can get me to the hospital. I then have to admit myself and prove that I need to get into the chamber. So once Dan punched that button, everything just worked beautifully. When I got to the chamber, I was a little bit concerned about who was going to be my hyperbaric doctor. When I say concerned, was I going to have some doctor with no dive experience saying to me, well, this was self-inflicted? Now, I don't know. I know of stories where people have gone to the chamber, they've gone in, and the hyperbaric doctor wasn't a dive physician as such, but they were a hyperbaric physician. Yep. And there have been, some stories about poor attitudes toward the divers. Now, I don't know of doctors saying to someone who was on a motorbike accident that was hit by a car, well, you shouldn't have been on a motorbike, And again, going off on a tangent, GUE teach their divers, right? Getting bent is a sports injury. We need to take the stigma away because we can do everything right and get bent.
Yes.
Even if we make a mistake and get bent, right? That doesn't mean that we intended to do that. We're all human. We make mistakes. So, and we can do everything wrong and not get bent, right? Correct. So that's the flip side of it. So we need to take away the stigma, which is why I'm happy to talk about this here today, because it's really important that if someone else has this experience, take care of yourself as much as what you would take care of someone else. And the sooner you get to the chamber and the sooner you seek help, the better it is for you and for the team.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an interesting and important point. I remember something sticks with me my entire life. One thing they taught us in the Navy when I was working, it's actually working as an engineer, but the same rules apply. If you even think something is wrong, tell someone. You know, if you think you've made a mistake, tell someone, because the sooner that a remedial action is taken, the better, right? And the same thing applies. And I remember I've had a couple of little scrapes myself. I had a diving the Poor Knights Islands, was doing 2 or 3 days of diving there, not particularly deep, but I came out of the water and I had shoulder pain. And I didn't really know why. So the first thing I did, I just pulled Andrew Simpson aside, who was leading the trip, and just said, "Hey, I've got a sore shoulder, don't know why." He said, "Okay, let's get the O2 out. Let's get you on O2 straight away, see how you respond to that." And it didn't really make any difference, which would immediately kind of suggest that maybe you're not bent. And then we were talking about the diving I'd been doing, and I'd been scootering, and probably didn't, in fact, I know I didn't have the cord adjusted properly because I'd borrowed the scooter and had been scootering, probably taking a fair bit of load on that arm. And so sure enough, there's a reason. And in that case, I wasn't bent, but spent some time on O2, which, you know, the cost of that is insignificant compared to, you know, what that could have been. And, you know, that's an example of speaking up. Obviously, actually on that trip, there could have been a chance the boat had to go back had I been bent. So, I mean, you've just got to realise that you've got to look after yourself, and there's no value in not speaking up if you think you might be bent.
Very much so. Very much so. And going on to that, so at midday on when it happened, 12 hours later I was in the chamber, and I went from being pretty much paralysed from the waist down to starting to get movement. So I had a slightly longer chamber treatment. I was put into a single room, and they were going to put me in the chamber again, and they said, "Oh, we're going to put you into a twin room because there's someone else that needs hyperbaric treatment, so I'll put you in the same room." And I'm like,
what were you thinking?
I'm like, you know, why would of all the times, fancy someone else needing hyperbaric treatments now? And they didn't tell me why they needed hyperbarics or anything. I had no idea what was happening. So I rock up into the chamber, and guess who's in the next chamber? So it was Harry. And I am ever so grateful. Oh, God, this is going to sound horrible. So I'm bent in South Africa on my own, day one. Day two, I happen to have someone on the team, our dive team. So it was nice having company, step one.
Yes.
Step two, Harry used to work at the hyperbaric, in the hyperbaric team in Adelaide. So that's another thing, another bonus. So any question, because of course I'm looking inward. Did I do this right? Did I do this? And Harry's like, no, you could have done this. I've seen this worse, blah, blah, blah. Harry's on the phone to Professor Simon Mitchell. And he's like, oh, if you need anything, right, just I've got Simon here. So, and I've been communicating with Simon as well, which has been great to have someone of that caliber, giving advice. So I didn't want Harry to be bent, but I'm grateful he was there, if that makes sense.
100%. Yeah, and I also understand with Simon. Simon's been on Speaking Sidemount. He's actually a former colleague of mine from my Navy days. He posted onto the ship that I left back in 1992, which is now sunk as a dive wreck. But in that episode, he and I talk, reminisce a bit about the Navy and talk a fair bit about hyperbaric medicine and his growth through that profession. And also we talk a lot about DCS in there as well. So that's, if anyone's listening, that's an episode worth exploring alongside this discussion in terms of understanding DCS. And of course, Simon's done some very, very notable online presentations and presentations at conferences on DCS and different aspects of it. So well worth listening to. And yeah, I mean, I did talk to him. I mentioned to you off mic that I had a suspected skin bend at one stage as well. And I called the hotline here. There's a hyperbaric hotline in New Zealand, which effectively goes through to a bunch of hyperbaric physicians, of which Simon kind of heads up that group. And I didn't talk to him that night. I spoke to someone else, but I talked to him subsequently about it, and it's great to have. I don't want to say he's on tap, but it's great to at least have a personal relationship with that guy, because if you do have a problem, then there's someone that you can talk to that knows his stuff.
Well, very much so. Like going back a bit, day one, after my first chamber treatment so on day one, first chamber treatment, got out, and my neurologist and my hyperbaric physician, they were saying, looking at where you were, oh, by the way, my hyperbaric physician, ex-military Navy diver, trimix diver, been to 160 metres, and an absolute delight. I meant to mention that. Dr. Mark Botha, brilliant guy. Because I was in South Africa, knew no one, his wife turned around and gave me all of these goodies. I was getting chocolates and magazines and chocky milk, biltong. It was just really, really awesome. Nice. So the social support that I had there was quite heartwarming. That was brilliant. But while I was there, during that week, my neurologist and my hyperbaric physician, they were both like, look, looking at your bend, we suspect that in 2 to 3 months, you should be at 50% of whatever recovery you're going to have. We suspect that at the 6-month mark, you'll be at about 80, 90%, and it'll take you a full 2 years to get to 100% of whatever recovery it is. So if I get to 100%, great. If I get to 90% pre-bend, it'll take 2 years. Now, that was the information that they were giving me. When I got to Oz, the hyperbaric team here, it seems that the hyperbaric team in Australia, in Perth, were brilliant. I need to say that to start with. When I was talking to the guys in South Africa, I was saying, I've got a trip to Robins in July. I was supposed to go with Craig to see Robin in July, and I was praying that I was going to be well enough to do that. And they're like, can't imagine you going there. And then I said, well, okay, 4 months post-bend or 3.5 months post-bend, whatever it was, September. So what's that, May, June, July, August, September. So yeah, 4 months post-bend. I've got a trip to the Nullarbor planned. And they go, look, depending on your recovery, you could probably go, but just see how your recovery goes. So they were talking about my diving post-bend. When I was in Australia, thanks to our super litigious society that we live in, because in Australia, we need a permit for everything. We need a permit just to go to the loo, unfortunately. So it was roughly, about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks into my hyperbarics in Australia. And I said, when do you think I'm going to return to diving? And they said, after a bend like this, no, you don't return to diving. And I'm like, what? I was like, well, first of all, that ain't going to happen. Well, and then they started giving me some scenario that would have been acceptable. And I guess from again, duty of care, locally, anything they say, I could have then said, well, the doctors gave me approval, right, and put it back on them. And that's unfortunately a bit of the society that we live in today, where if I do something silly because someone else told me that it was okay, I can now sue them. Really?
Yeah. Australia is a little bit unique along with America, right? It's like the States and Australia just have this, and I don't know why you guys are that way. I mean, because we're so different here in New Zealand. Not so much that there's no duty of care, that's completely incorrect, but because we have what's called accident compensation. If you have an injury, there's a government agency that we all contribute taxes to, and there's a specific payment for it that pays for any accidents. And as part of the act that enacts that, you actually can't sue people. So we have we don't have any lawyers chasing ambulances or any ability to sue. You can be prosecuted for negligence, and you can be prosecuted for other things, and of course you can have civil cases, but it really doesn't happen. So as a result, and that does drive behaviour, doesn't it? I mean, we see it in South Australia as well with cave diving there, and landowners and the protection they have to have, and the waivers that you have to sign, and the insurances that everybody covers, all because of the litigiousness of what's going on. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
I'm hearing you. So I then had some separate information, and it was a case like I wasn't going to be doing anything silly. I was even told, don't dive, don't go for a pool dive. And I'm like, okay, I'm in a chamber on pure oxygen. I'm at 18 metres, so I've got a PO2 of 2.8. And if I use pure O2 in a pool at 2.8 metres, you're saying don't do it. Okay, you guys know better than me. I won't do it. I finally did get a clearance to dive because when it was, first of all, you're not diving or you shouldn't be diving again, we went through a few of the logistics, and then they said, oh, you can have caveats where you dive to 14 or 20 or this or that. And I'm like, well, okay, if I start returning to diving and I'm on a rebreather and I'm at 15 meters, for example, I could actually have a lower PN2 than at the surface, right? And if I'm staying out of if you do all those things, that's fine. So there seems to be a whole bunch of stuff that's fine, but because if you do one thing that's not fine, like don't do it type thing. So there's a degree of over cautiousness. And as a diver, I could dive now and do everything. I could do a similar dive. Like, I don't necessarily intend to go back to 210 meters. My favorite dives are shallow distance dives. And again, I was out on the Nullarbor. As I said, I was out 3 kilometers in the back of a cave. 0 decompression obligation, 99 NDL the entire dive. And that's on like I think it was like a 40-60 GF factor. Mm-hmm. So it's up to me to make sure I don't do anything silly. At the moment, if I'm in the water, I'm going to be using nitrox on an air computer, for example, or I'll run 2 computers, one being real world, one being hypothetical on air, so it's a lot more conservative, and I'll dive on that one compared to what's really happening. I don't intend on doing any decompression diving this side of Christmas, and I may never decompression dive again. But most of my shallow cave dives don't require that. So if I never deco dive again, 80% of what I do hasn't changed. So I'm still out there having fun in a safe manner.
Yeah, and let's imagine in a Walgan dive for a moment where you're diving for your relatively long duration at 14 metres. I mean, there's nothing stopping you on a rebreather coming back and stopping at 6 metres for X amount of time on 100% O2, and adding conservatism to what would generally be a 99 computer dive, but you're basically saying, well, every dive's a deco dive, I'll just do some decompression on this.
That 3 kilometre dive was a 5 hour and 5 minute dive, to be exact, and allowing for the partial pressures that we were doing, there was no point. There was just no point. The average depth, I think, was 6 metres. So I think it's about I think it's at 6 metres on air, where you can't. It's such a long time for to hit deco, let alone on a breather. So air at an average of 6 is what, roughly 0.33 PO2. I'm running a 0.1. So sorry, a 1.0.
That was one of my questions too, is what do you plan to do now post this? And so given that you are now 5 months out of this incident, how is the body now? How are you feeling? Are you feeling as if you really want to be getting back into it, or is it, well, I guess you've just told us you're kind of conservative, but how are you doing right now?
Post-bend, I fatigue a lot easier. If this happens to anyone, and it doesn't matter what injury you have, you've got to do your physio. I've had both hips done. So in 2017, my left one was done. And because I wasn't doing prehab, my rehab took a long time, and it was a different style of operation. So after 2017, I was really watching this, the stretching and the exercises I was doing on a regular basis. When I had my other hip done in 2020 or 21, 2 weeks and 2 days after I got out of hospital, I was doing like a 2.5K scuba dive in the river here, which was great. So I know that if I want to get better, right, it's no point just going to the physio. I have to push myself. So when I was in the hospital, it was like I'd see the physio, I'd need 2 hours sleep. I'd then get up and repeat the exercises, say twice a day. While I was in the hospital, unsupervised, I'd start off by pushing myself around in a wheelchair, followed by pushing, using the walker to get around the hospital. Then I was walking to the entry of the hospital and back. There was about a 300 metre each way walk, so 600 metres per trip. When I did that, I'd need a few hours sleep, but you just got to push and push and push. Since I've been back, I had in-home physiotherapy and occupational therapy. Then I was seeing, and still am seeing, a spinal neurophysiotherapy, and they put me on all of these exercises that now I'm actually stronger now post-bend than pre-bend, right? Great. As far as my ability of what I can do. The difference is I don't have the agility, the coordination. So it's one thing being able to lift, say, a couple of cylinders and dragging them around. It's easier than I said pre-bend. But when it comes to having to, for example, if you had to dance, that would be difficult, right? Trying to get that coordination. Were you
a great dancer before the bend?
Actually, I loved Latin American dancing, so I'd love to get back into that.
That could be my excuse then.
So look, the coordination is coming back. At the physio, they lay what looks like a ladder on the ground, and you have to do this dance like the Mexican hat dance, but going sideways and coordinate it. So that's all coming back. Whenever I walk, it's like wearing a pair of pants with 15 to 25 pound of lead, right? So that's just the sensation that I have in my legs. So the warm feet is gone. The numbness has pretty much gone. I've still got pins and needles. So I do still have neurological symptoms. And while that persists, I really want to avoid the decompression diving. But I have to go to the gym or the physio or dive, right, 3 to 4 times a week to keep up that level of exercise to keep the recovery going. So I get fatigued easier now than pre-bend. My choices are do nothing and not be fatigued, get on with life and be fatigued. I'll go for option 2.
Good man. Good man. So obviously hindsight's 2020 and everybody always wants to ask the question about, what caused this. And sometimes I know, there just isn't really an answer to that. But as you reflect back on the dives that you did in Bushman's Hole over that entire trip, can you put your finger on anything that you think contributed towards the fact that you had a DCS incident in the last dive?
Okay, several things. With the benefit of hindsight, right, although I was satisfied to a degree, I was running a GF of 75, and since it was more of a bounce dive than anything else, my GF low would have, changing my GF low would have forced a deeper first stop. Yes. Even if I left it at 75 and just added in a stop, say at 110 meters, right, being the halfway mark, I think that could have helped. Something that we should have done, had an off day of no diving. You're paying a lot of money to get to these places, so you're trying to get, as much diving in as possible. In saying that, we were doing a morning dive only. We weren't doing multiple dives in a day. But having a day off the diving could have helped. Again, I've asked Harry a lot of these questions, and he's given me examples where people had similar type trips. And with each hindsight answers that I came up with, he said, I've seen people worse than you. I've seen people worse than you. So they could have helped as a possibility. One other thing that I did that particular morning, like, every morning I have a routine of stretches, sit-ups and push-ups. I was running late that morning. I raced through my sit-ups, not even thinking about don't exert yourself before a dive. Now, it wasn't a horrendous amount of sit-ups, right? But I did race through them, right? And I did actually slightly hurt myself in my stomach. And funnily enough, T8, which is ballpark, the camera roughly about here, that is where the bend started. So was it coincidence? Was it a cause? I don't know. I had a little bit more caffeine that morning than what I usually do.
You can ignore that one.
Yeah, well, look, again, when it comes to the talks, I'm listening to people saying too much caffeine, a little bit's good, too much is not.
Sure.
I don't know. But when I spoke to my hyperbaric physician in South Africa, And also to Harry, it's like, doesn't matter what you think of, right? You can't put your finger on it. Had I done all of those things, sure, I don't think it would have happened. But it did.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I've been in similar situations, like the Truck Lagoon trips is a classic example where you go there for 10 to 12 days of diving. Every day you've got a decompression dive, not as deep by any means, but you're doing multiple days at 55, 60, 70 meters. And one thing and Harry has been the hyperbaric physician on that trip, so Simon Mitchell, and so they've both kind of experienced this. And Pete, does often have bends cases on those trips, most often skin bends, but they've had a couple of serious incidents as well. And so they have implemented some changes to the way that they've dived over the years, and one of those is recommending a day off partway through the trip. The other thing, obviously, not 2 decompression dives in a day. That was a famous Tom Steiner saying as well. 1 deco dive a day keeps the doctor away. But we're talking typically not necessarily as deep as you were diving as well. So maybe that makes it even more important, that day off philosophy. The other thing that we did do, certainly on my trips, and part of it was just the way I like to dive anyhow, is I started out doing 2 dives a day, deco dive in the morning, shallow dive in the afternoon, and then by the time we got to day 4, I was just doing 1 dive a day, and would come back, do that dive. So this is repetitive 60 meter plus, 50 meter plus dives. And I've done that a lot in Gozo as well, where I was trimix guiding, and that would be multiple dives of 60 meters on successive days. And it's 1 a day, take it really easy outside of that. But as you rightly say, I mean, who knows? I mean, any one of those could have resulted in a different outcome. And we follow the rules as best we can, but especially the deeper you go, the greater the risk, right?
That's exactly it. I mean, the number of people that I've had say to me, once you get beyond 150 is what it is. The algorithms weren't really designed to do those sorts of dives, were they?
No. I remember asking Harry when we were talking about pierced resurgence, what are you using? And he says, just Boesman gradient factors, and he talked quite about a few dives that they'd done there where they'd reach the 12 meter stop and get a little bit of joint pain and decide to pop down a little deeper again for a while, so exactly as you described. So I mean, it's symptomatic. Well, it's a function of that sort of diving at times as well. So, mate, it's such a compelling story, and I'm so glad that you're well and that the outcome was a good story as opposed to something much worse than that. So I'm very, very pleased that you're here talking to us today. Amazing story, and I loved hearing about the mapping of Bushman's Hole as well and the changes that have resulted from that, and can't wait to see JDZ's 3D map of that as well. That I'm sure would be really special. Big thing going on in cave diving right now is 3D mapping of caves, and just the visual impression that gives both us as cave divers, but also those who don't cave dive. It's amazing what it's doing. Mate, I've enjoyed chatting. Great to see you again.
Likewise,
thanks
mate,
so much for joining us.
Cool, thank you.
You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast and would like to support the show, then why not become a patron of Speaking Sidemount? For as little as $5 per month, you can become a part of the Speaking Sidemount team, get exclusive early access to all of the episodes, and help us to deliver the very best sidemount, cave, and technical dive content available. Just go to www.patreon.com/speakingsidemount for all of the details. The address is also on our Facebook page, listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us for our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.